What he found in that book was a clear presentation of the subtle and sophisticated understanding of God, characteristic of Catholic thought. He had assumed, like most of his peers and friends, that God was a noisy mythological figure, and religion the stuff of neuroses and projections. He had never imagined that people could speak of God in such a compelling and intellectually satisfying way. What he found most specifically was the idea of God's aseity, God's capacity to exist through himself. He found what we explored in an earlier episode of this series, namely that God is not one being among many, but ipsum esse subsistens, the sheer act of being itself. This God began to pull and tug at Merton with great power. In the wake of his encounter with Gilson's book, Merton's life began to change. He wanted to commune with the God whom he had discovered intellectually. He first attended some Protestant services. His mother had been a Quaker, but he found himself unmoved. Then one Sunday morning, he woke up with an intense desire to go to Mass. Merton came here to the Church of Corpus Christi on 121st Street on the Upper West Side. He entered the place nervously. He knew very little about the Mass, didn't know how to behave, and he slipped into a side pew. But he made it through the liturgy, and again, though he half understood it, when he walked out of this church, he said he felt as though he had entered a new world. Even the ugly buildings of Columbia, he said, were transfigured. Then he sat down for breakfast at a crummy little diner on 111th Street. And though he was in that simple place, he said, it was as though I was sitting in the Elysian fields. Later that year, Thomas Merton was walking here down 6th Avenue with his friend Robert Lax. Lax turned to him and said, Tom, what do you want out of life? Merton said, well, I suppose I want to be a good Catholic. Lax said, no, that's not enough. You should want to be a saint. That comment convinced Merton he had to think in a much more radical way about his spiritual life. He began to explore different religious orders in the hopes that they would accept him as a candidate for the priesthood. He was initially accepted by the Franciscans, but when he revealed the story of his past, they let him go. He became a professor of English at the small Franciscan College of St. Bonaventure's. While on break from St. Bonaventure's, he sat down in New York with his good friend Daniel Walsh, who was a professor of philosophy at Columbia. Walsh encouraged him to make a retreat during Holy Week at the Trappist Monastery of Our Lady of Gethsemane in Kentucky. Merton said, what he discovered here was the still point around which the whole country revolves without knowing it. What he sensed was the power of adoratio, adoration, the ordering of one's life around the proper praise of God. The following December, just days after Pearl Harbor, Merton entered the monastery himself, commencing a 27-year career as monk, poet, and spiritual writer. Most fundamentally, he became a man utterly absorbed in prayer. God addresses people in different ways. Some are drawn into the spiritual life in very ordinary ways. Nothing extraordinary happens. Others have things even beyond what Merton had. People have extraordinary visions and encounters with Jesus. His was kind of somewhere in the middle. I call it a vivid mystical experience. God calls people in different ways. Some wouldn't respond to that. They wouldn't know what to do with it. It wouldn't fit their psyche, their personality, their background. Some people are kind of natural mystics, the way people are natural baseball players. That kid is a natural. He just knows how to throw that ball without being told. Some people, and I think Merton's one of them, are natural mystics. And they just kind of respond to the divine in this natural way, but different. There are many mansions in the Father's house and many different ways to approach God. Merton's great spiritual master, the teacher to whom he consistently looked, was a 16th century Spaniard named Juan de Yepes y Alvarez, better known by his religious name, Juan de la Cruz, John of the Cross. John of the Cross was born in 1542 and became a Carmelite friar in 1563. Under the influence of Saint Teresa of Avila, John dedicated himself to the reform of his order, returning it to its gospel simplicity and zeal. Like most reformers, John was unpopular among those whom he wished to reform. In December of 1577, a group of his Carmelite brothers arrested him. They brought him here to Toledo and they imprisoned him in the Carmelite monastery that stood right behind the wall that you can see behind me. They placed John in a tiny, stifling room, 6 feet by 10 feet. They removed him from that place only to have him kneel in the refectory where he was beaten by his brothers. While holed up in that tiny room, John began to compose in his mind poetry. They constitute some of the gems of Spanish literature and the high point of the Catholic spiritual tradition, because in those poems, he talks about the life of intimate union with God. 9 months after he was imprisoned, John, in a rather dramatic way, made good his escape, clambering down over that wall you can see behind me. What stands at the heart of John's teaching? In his treatise called The Living Flame of Love, John offers a powerful image for the human soul. We human beings, he says, have within us great caverns, which are infinitely deep, unfathomable. These are intellect, will, and feeling. They are infinite, unfathomable, precisely because they are ordered to God. The mind wants to know everything about everything. It won't rest until it is illumined by the divine truth. The will wants infinite goodness. It will not rest until it rests in the absolute good of God. The feelings ache with an infinite longing because they are ordered to the infinity of God. This is why, by the way, most of us are so restless and dissatisfied most of the time. John diagnosed a fundamental spiritual disorder this way. We try to fill these infinitely deep caverns with the petty goods of this world, with pleasure, sex, power, honor. This leads, as we've already seen, to addiction, as we try more and more and more of these unsatisfying goods. Or else, he said, we cover the caverns over, pretending they're not really there. We live life in a completely superficial way, ignoring the depths within. If we want to fulfill these longings, we have to go through a purging process. All the spiritual teachers talk about the purgative way, the process by which we rid ourselves of these attachments, these substitutes for God, what John would call idols. John of the Cross delineates this as a two-step process involving the dark night of the senses and the dark night of the soul. It's very important to point out this has nothing to do with Puritanism, nothing to do with the repudiation of the goodness of the world. John affirms the goodness of the world at every turn. And secondly, though these two steps are painful, they have nothing to do with psychological depression. They are, if you will, practical antidotes to idolatry.